Just wanna be a woman. Living, loving, giving kind of woman. Dressed so fine, good looking kind of woman. I want a sex change operation. The ladies move my destination. I'm hanging out with the boys. My opinion is my choice, 'cause I wanna be a woman. Living, loving, giving kind of woman. Just so fine, good looking kind of woman. Come on, girl. You know you know. 'Cause I wanna be a woman. A living, loving, giving kind of woman. Just a fine looking kind of woman. I want a sex change operation. The ladies move my destination. I'm hanging out with the boys. My penis, my choice, 'cause I wanna be a woman. 'Cause I wanna be a woman. 'Cause I wanna be a woman. 'Cause I wanna be a woman.
Hi everyone. Today we'll get into our last institution with respect to gender and gender inequality, looking at the institution of media. Just a brief recap before we turn our attention to media. Last presentation we looked at two institutions, the institution of sport and education. So just briefly kind of running through what we talked about. As a gendered institution, both education and sport, you can see that separation of the sexes going on, often formally in sports, more often informally in education. But nevertheless, you see that separation of the sexes into different spaces, which again makes it much easier to socialize the sexes in terms of what's considered to be the gendered appropriate socialization. In addition, we see the her and his dimensions of the gendered institutions. Sports that are considered to be for girls, for women, sports that are considered to be for boys and for men. And then also in terms of education, the her and his dimensions in terms of how people utilize space, where you hang out, where you eat, but also in terms of her and his academics. What majors are we feminizing? What majors do we male type? So turning our attention to the gendering, here again we see the production of gendered culture and the socialization of those gendered meanings within the spaces provided to us by our schools and by different sports. And we talked about how this can be done, again, formally, informally, the socialization process. In education, more often than not, it's from your peers. It's the kind of peer policing that you kind of try to toe the line because you're afraid of being held accountable for any deviations from the norm. Or perhaps you actually are kind of sanctioned by your peers for not looking, not acting what's considered to be, again, gender appropriate. In sports, we do see that going on. Definitely, people can be teased, perhaps, by a coach, perhaps by teammates for stepping outside of gender boundaries. But sport as an institution, as we've talked about, is an interesting institution because you do see more what we consider gender neutral spaces where guys can perform activities, behaviors that we consider to be feminine activities and behaviors, but they can get away with it rather than being sanctioned. So let's say that you're showing those soft emotions, you're being intimate with other boys, other men. If you're doing those activities at school, in education, for example, often people will hold you accountable for deviating from the expectation. But when you're doing those same behaviors in sport, people kind of let you get away with it. And then the same thing can be said for women performing different activities and traits we consider to be masculine. Perhaps in a school setting, they would be called out for it. They'd be teased by their peers, but in the sports setting, it's considered to be okay. It's just considered to be kind of people playing a game rather than a girl or a woman displaying certain types of behaviors. So we talked about inequality between the sexes. We see a disparity of pay and status connected to the her and his dimensions in both institutions. In education, if you kind of follow the path laid out for you in terms of her academics, more often than not, that path is going to, relatively speaking, end up in lower pay and status compared to the paths that are more gender neutral or the paths that are more male typed. And you see the same thing going on with sports and how the female athletes, uh, relatively speaking, again, no matter what kind of level you're looking at, often are receiving the short end of the stick in terms of pay and overall social recognition compared to male athletes. And we can look at within sport, as we talked about before, the objectification of the female athlete. So here's some more inequality where the male athlete is recognized based upon his merit, being an athlete. The female athlete is more often recognized in terms of her physical appearance. And so the most popular male athlete tends to be the best athlete at his sport, where the most popular female athletes tend to be not necessarily the best at their sport. They're good, they're professional, but more so one of the better looking athletes in their sport. As usual, the book does a good job kind of breaking down a lot of different dimensions of media in relation to gender and different gender inequalities. But what I'll do again, as I have been doing, rather than giving you a summary, of the chapter, kind of page by page, kind of break down some of the key ideas in reference to media as a gendered institution, gendering institution, and again looking at the promotion of inequalities between the sexes. But before we get into that breakdown, we can look at the media today and say a couple things. Firstly, we can say that the media today is more powerful than ever as a source of cultural production. So, in other words, the reach and the ultimate influence of media today is much larger and stronger than ever before. And this applies to all forms of culture, both kind of non-gender culture forms, but also gender culture forms as well. You can hardly, turn on your smartphone screen, your computer screen, your television without seeing directly or indirectly some gender meanings being kind of put in your direction, being exposed to your social psychology. So we can also say regarding the media today that yes, it's more influential than ever before, but also we can recognize there is more diversity than ever before. So with the expansion of cable television, with the expansion of streaming, and with the expansion of the internet and wireless technologies, we can look at the media, although there is overlap between the two, we can look at the media as being kind of media with a capital M, kind of the mainstream media, and what you get culturally speaking there, versus media with a lowercase m, would be more non-traditional, more alternative cultural ways that you're getting within the media that's kind of more marginalized than in the mainstream. So yes, it's more powerful today in terms of creating culture gender culture specifically for our purposes, but also we can recognize today more so than ever before there is more gender diversity, and the diversity mostly exists on the margins and needs to be sought out, but nevertheless it's there, and sometimes it begins on the margins, then sometimes overlaps into the mainstream media. So just off the top of my head, I know my wife recently has been watching Vice. So like it was kind of a presidential figure, vice presidential figure, as a kind of strong, smart, although humorous woman. So again, a different kind of portrayal compared to what we're used to. That's kind of men dominating the higher positions in politics. We could also look at The Wire. It was an HBO show that I liked a lot, and one of their lead characters, Omar, he was very kind of the hegemonic masculine male in every aspect besides his sexuality. And so it's this again different in terms of you see this kind of stereotypical lead male character, strong, stoic, always in control, cool at school, but then he was different in terms of his sexuality. So again, you see these versions of people today much more than you could see them, 10, 20 years ago. And again, although sometimes you have to seek them out, they may be more on the margins of media. Nevertheless, they are there, and more often they do kind of end up in mainstream spaces as well. As a gendered institution, we can break the media down in many different ways. So again, I'm giving you a relatively shorter list of all the different aspects you could really unpack because the institution is so large and influential. You could have an entire semester's worth of discourse on the media and its connection to gender and gender culture. But, just to familiarize ourselves with a few important points, we can look at how the media represents a gendered institution where it is a site of sex separation. Now, sometimes we don't see this sex separation, although, it's very obvious when we do think about it or open our eyes, because the sex separation often is going on behind the scenes. So, we really don't pay too close attention to who is in the credits. So, we don't pay too much mind to those people doing the writing, the directing, the producing. But, all that behind the scene work is important because all that behind the scene work is what goes into that final product we do see, whether it be images on our computers, in magazines, on TV, in theaters. So, often we don't see the sex segregation because the separation is going on behind the scenes and we're really not oblivious. We're not really aware to it. So we are kind of oblivious to how big of disparities there are when it comes to who's directing, who is writing a lot of the mainstream media. And the gap isn't that big with the media with a lowercase m, but nevertheless, the mainstream media is important because it's mainstream. It creates that dominant culture that outweighs kind of the non-dominant cultural ways. So, the book again kind of talks about different people in terms of who's doing the producing, who's doing the directing. But I think the other side of the coin is not only we need to recognize that men disproportionately control the writing and the producing, thus men disproportionately control the narrative when it comes to media culture. Women disproportionately, on the other hand, are the ones disproportionately being produced. Women really don't have a strong say in their own narratives in terms of how they look, how they act, their roles. So men are kind of controlling disproportionately the production of the female in terms of who she is, what she's about. And this is important because, when you get this kind of portrayal through the mind and the eye of the male, and again, it's a very limited male in terms of often it's the wealthy, white, upper class, heterosexual male, and we'll come back to this later, that's controlling the imagery. You get a very kind of one-dimensional, one-sided view of women as a result. And so again, women lack the autonomy in terms of how they are portrayed in the media. Rather than being a one-trick pony often, if women were writing the stories, if women were producing the media, you'd see multi-dimensional characters, multi-dimensional women on the screen. But often you don't see that because it's the men kind of dominating the process of media creation. And again, it's just real, when you do see women writing and producing their own shows, what you see, and it shouldn't be a surprise, are those multi-dimensional characters played by women. So it does matter who is in control in terms of what you see, what you don't see in the final products. So kind of getting into that idea of kind of who we see and how they are seen, men, you see more diversity in terms of the roles they're playing. So men can play the good guys, the bad guys, the heroes, the villains, the humorous roles, the serious roles. They can be attractive, they can be perhaps not very attractive or unattractive. So there's, again, kind of more in terms of diversity, more types of roles being played by men. And the men you do see compared to women come from more diverse class backgrounds, more diverse racial categories, and especially when it comes to age, much more diversity in terms of age groups. You'll see men who are younger, who are older, and kind of everything in between. And again, all this is compared to women. So if you see more diversity of men in all these variables, you're going to see less diversity of women. So again, all things being equal, you'd see kind of the same amounts of diversity, when it comes to age and race, but you don't see that. Women disproportionately compared to men are of a younger age category. Usually kind of the mid-20s starts to become the cutoff, where you start to see less and less women who are older than, 25, 26. And race, again, disproportionately, you see fewer racial categories compared to men. When you're looking at women in media, again, class background, typically you're kind of getting the middle/upper class portrayal of women in terms of how they're dressing, how they're speaking, their overall style and self-presentation. And again, you see less diversity of roles. The roles are not as diverse compared to the male role, where the female is more the supporter of the male. The female often is there as the kind of object for men's desire. So overall, you can start to see those differences when looking at male and female characters. And we can look at LGBT portrayals as well. And what studies have shown is that disproportionately, when you're looking at this community, you're looking at white individuals, so both white women and men, kind of dominate the coverage compared to non-whites. And again, disproportionately, you see a lot more men in terms of the community compared to women. So we can talk about her and his media, just as we've talked about kind of her and his academics, her and his sports. So in her and his media, we have gender type music, television, movies, and magazines. And I think over time, the amount of gender neutral media has grown significantly. But still, we can see that certain types of music are associated with women compared to men. Certain types of television programming, movies and magazines are kind of typed as being for women or typed for being for men. And an idea that we've talked about before, here women have a little bit of a longer leash and they receive more opportunities to engage in the kind of other media types without receiving negative sanctions. So, in other words, if a guy or a boy wants to cross boundaries and read literature, watch movies or television considered to be for women, then often, again, maybe it's his peers or even a parent, a teacher or coach may formally, informally kind of sanction the kid and kind of let him know that he's stepping outside gender boundaries. But when girls and when women are kind of stepping into the male typed media, usually, nothing is said. People don't think twice too much about it. But when guys kind of move in the other direction into the feminized media, usually people do kind of see it and people do kind of think about it more on that conscious level. As a gendering institution, we just kind of take it to that next level and kind of recognize how the media is producing that gendered culture. And when we're exposed to that gendered culture, whether it be the lyrics in music, whether it be the storylines in television and movies, or the images that we see, on the internet, in magazines, or throughout the different types of visual media, this culture, again, directly, indirectly, is telling us a story, and often it's a gendered story. How people are supposed to act, how you're supposed to look, what is desirable, what you don't want to come across as. And again, sometimes we're aware of the socialization, but more often than not, it's indirect socialization. We kind of learn the lessons without even really thinking about the lessons being learned. So, when looking at that producing gender culture and socializing people with these kind of normative or perhaps non normative gender meanings, we can turn our attention back to the media with a capital M and media with a lowercase m, and the different culture kind of attached to each. So, for the former, the media with a capital M, usually you get that kind of traditional gendered culture that you get kind of in that mainstream media. When you're looking at women, usually, relatively speaking, they're younger women. Uh, Often they are sexualized to various degrees. They're objectified to various degrees. And this kind of ties into that beauty myth that we talked about earlier in the semester when looking at the gender body. And then again, disproportionately in the mainstream media, the men who are portrayed and the men who often get more of the limelight. So again, you see maybe men and women in more kind of secondary background roles, but the kind of main roles given to the sexes here with men, they're typically older compared to women, and usually they come across as being strong, whether it be strong in terms of a physical, emotional sense. And in the chapter, she talks about the three different types of R's and how that kind of relates to the mainstream media portrayal of men. And then we can compare that to the culture connected to the more alternative media, the media with the lowercase m. And again, just the main theme that we'll see is there's more diversity. Yeah, you can see younger women, perhaps that are sexualized. You can see older men kind of portrayed as a hegemonic male, but there's much more of an array of representations of the sexes when it comes to all those different variables, whether it be one's age, one's race, one's class, one's sexuality. So again, that kind of alternative media culture that exists, definitely see more diverse more alternative ways of thinking about understanding the sexes. And, I'll bring it back to what I talked about briefly. This all connects back to that division of labor. Usually who is writing, who controls the narrative matters. And when you have more diversity in terms of the production of the media, then you often get more diversity in the media's final project. So the culture that you get is more diverse because the culture is created by a more diverse creator. And the opposite is true for the mainstream media, where, again, traditionally speaking, you see a very strong division of labor connected to, men of a certain class, a certain sexuality, a certain race, kind of dominating the creation of culture. Thus, you get a very small perspective of the social experience, whether it be, again, the magazines that you're reading, the websites that you're following, or, whatever kind of streaming show that you're watching. But again, we can acknowledge that diversity today is much higher than ever before, and the diversity that exists often is a direct product of a more diverse kind of creator behind it, whether it be who's writing the narratives, who's shooting the images, so on and so on. Lastly, we can look at media in reference to the inequality between the sexes. So, often this goes back to the gendered institution. And so how when we separate the sexes into different spaces, it's easy to create inequality between the sexes as a result. In other words, if the sexes are performing the same roles, if they're in the same spaces, it's much more difficult to create the inequality, to create the disparities. But when you put them in different roles and responsibilities, it's much easier to create the inequalities as a result. So we start to see the promotion of inequality connected to sex segregation in terms of who is controlling the media narratives, who is being controlled by the media narratives. So again, no matter if you're looking at images on the internet, images in magazines, storylines in media, again, what you often see is the segregation, men controlling the media, thus women being controlled by it. And, going back to that beauty myth and the gender body that we talked about, kind of on that social psychological level, these cultural meanings produced by the media can have real social psychological consequences for people whether it be the racial minority or whether it be the woman, or no matter kind of what category you're looking at, when you're looking at the minority often being portrayed in the media as very one-dimensional, as a one-trick pony, studies do reveal that this can have real social psychological consequences for the individuals. We're not trying to say that men are off the hook here, where the portrayals of men masculinity in media don't have any real social psychological consequences for boys and men, because they do. But again, compared to those who are in the minority categories, it's not as widespread, it's not as severe when it comes to the negative social psychological consequences that are experienced by men compared to the other individuals. So we can look at the promotion of inequality, and again, we can look at inequality in terms of the images of the people and the consequences of the images. But I wanted to bring to our attention kind of that other conversation that we've been having here, is that yes, we see that mainstream traditional media promoting a traditional gender culture, But again, it's important to recognize how progress is being made, where there's a lot of gender neutral culture being produced, and there's a lot of non normative cultural ways being produced. And taken together, this kind of media culture with the lowercase m symbolically challenges that heteronormative culture that we're so used to. And when you are challenging that heteronormative culture, you also challenge, you also question its privileges that it provides the deemed normatives. So you're challenging the privileges that are given to heterosexuals. You're challenging the privileges that are given to men based upon that heteronormative culture that we're exposed to more often than not in the mainstream media. So, I think that's important to bring to our attention. Yes, the media can promote inequalities, but that same media can be used to promote more equality by producing more gender neutral material in more non normative cultural ways.